Our speaker is David McKinney. He is a horticulturalist, ecologist, and entomologist and plant physiologist currently working as the curator at the Iowa Arboretum and Gardens, where he manages 160 acres of gardens, prairie restoration, and native woodland. He's originally from Colorado, received 3 degrees in horticulture from Colorado State University, while also coordinating extensive perennial trials and demonstration gardens. He's passionate about native plants and the interactions between plants and wildlife. On top of his curatorial work, David is an award-winning writer and speaker, recently receiving the Emerging Perennial Professional Award from the Perennial Plant Association and Kenneth Post Award from the American Society for Horticultural Science. So thank you, David, for being here with us this evening.
Hi everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in this evening as I introduce the Iowa Arboretum and Gardens Trial Program. This program was started by me and one of my staff in 2023. And I'll get a little bit into why we started this program and why it's so important. And so a little bit of background about me. I am originally from the Denver area. I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and went to school in Fort Collins. And right out of school, I decided that I wanted to become a horticultural specialist at the Denver Zoo. And I was there for a while, working with plants and animals in that space. And so I got to do a lot of really cool things working in conservation. I developed a passion for entomology. And so I'm now also an expert on solitary wasps. And so those wasp species that are parasitic and parasitoid in their ecology. And I've always just loved the outdoors. I've been in this horticulture industry for about 15 years now. Started as a teenager mowing lawns and worked my way up from there. Now I am located at the Iowa Arboretum and Gardens. As my bio said, it's 160 acres. 40 acres of that little square you can see there on the left of your screen is our 40 cultivated acres. And so that's where any of our horticulture, formal horticulture takes place. And then the rest of our land is prairie restoration that we manage, as well as native intact woodland. While I was at Colorado State University, I tried to get into as many diverse experiences in the industry as possible. So I started off working at a family-owned nursery and landscaping company. And so it was a little bit of a forward for my later work at the zoo. I was the snake handler in the retail section. And after that, decided that I wanted to get a little bit more into research. And so I worked at the Colorado State University Perennial Demonstration Gardens, taking data on about 1,500 different perennial varieties there. And this is what the Colorado State University's trial program looks like. It's about 3 acres. An acre of that is annuals. And in general, they evaluate almost 2,000 annual varieties a year. The top of that little box there is the Perennial Demonstration Garden, which is about an acre. And then I specifically worked in the Perennial Trials Department, which was also about an acre. And on an average year, we would be evaluating about 300 perennials. And during my time there, I evaluated about 500 varieties. And this work is really important. As you can see there on the right of your screen, it's a way for us to interact with the public and a way for us to show the plants that are coming down the pipeline from the industry, soon to be available to gardeners. And it gives you very site-specific information about the plants that are successful in your region. And so I adored that work. These gardens were quite beautiful, and I got to see a broad diversity of perennials. Like I mentioned, this demo garden had about 1,500 different varieties in it. There's the annuals there. I didn't have a lot to do with the annual program, but these were my babies. So we had a shade section and a sun section there, and these plants were trialed for 3 years in the ground. And after they had successfully survived the trial program, they were then promoted and marketed by the greater industry. So I've touched on a little bit, but what is a trial program? They're located across the country. There are dozens of programs, many of them regionally specific. However, they tend to be tied to a public garden or a university. So, for instance, here in central Iowa, some of our closest trial programs are in the Twin Cities with the University of Minnesota, or Chicago with the Chicago Botanic Gardens. There are many on the East Coast, in the Southeast, and in the Pacific Northwest. And the purpose of these gardens is to be the public facing aspect of the trialing process. So, a lot of private companies, as they are developing plants, will have their own trial program internally that is not open to the public until those plants have either been patented or released for the market. And so people don't get to see how well they perform in the ground in their region. Oftentimes, these trial programs are in a unique or untested climate. So, for instance, Iowa has never had a formal perennial trial program, and so it has a unique climate that can give that information to the industry and to consumers. And they're always public facing or research focused. Oftentimes, the public facing aspect of that is what makes these trial programs so successful. Overall, these programs have five main goals. These are the goals that oftentimes they're founded in, these are their missions. And so, for our own program, we are looking to test the long term performance of plant varieties for industry partners. And so, what does that mean? We ourselves, as the Arboretum, are not choosing what plants go into the trial, they're being submitted by the plant breeding companies. And so they submit a plant and it comes with a little bit of cash so that we can sustain the program for as long as we need to take the research. But we are not the ones selecting or choosing the plants that get put into the trial program. The second goal is to inform our regional consumers of the best plants for their gardens. And so if a plant has performed exceptionally well, it looks excellent in the garden, survives our winters and our summers very well. It's our opportunity to then promote that plant to consumers. And then it gives insight into consumer preference or desires for the industry. I've noticed a lot of times that our end consumer, the home gardener, doesn't get to have a lot of that communication with the industry. And so this is your chance to share your opinions about the plants that are being developed, maybe what you want to see more, or what are the gardening trends that we can anticipate for the next 2 or 3 years so that companies can then feed into that and give you plants that you would actually like to garden with. Fourth, we provide marketing and promotion for plants that perform well. And so, if a plant does exceptionally well, we use it in talks like this, or we publish newsletters or press releases, basically lauding these plants for being really great in the central Iowa climate. And then finally, these gardens serve as a demonstration, education, and engagement tool for oftentimes our local consumers and industry. And so it's not uncommon for us to see folks walking the garden with like a shopping list and writing down plants that they really like to then go look for. And we also see industry folks coming in to see what they should be providing in their retail garden center space. And so these are the overall goals of what our trial program seeks to do. And like I mentioned, there are trial programs throughout the country. So this is an aerial shot of the trial program at the Chicago Botanic Gardens. They have a perennial and shrub trial as well. And you can see here that there are perennials lined up in rows that are getting similar data taken 3 years in the ground. And at the end of that, the best plants get promoted. And maybe one of the most world-renowned trial programs in the country is taking place at Mount Cuba in Delaware. And so, what makes this particular trial program so unique is that they will experiment with a single genus at a time. So, for instance, in this photo here, it's they're experimenting with Monarda or bee bombs, and they publish a report that compares and contrasts all of the available cultivars of that specific genus and then basically selects a couple top performers that are then the best for the Mid-Atlantic region. And so eventually we would like to get to the point where we can also do a similar program where we can basically compare cultivars across a genus and basically say these specific varieties are the best for the Midwest. If you aren't familiar with Mount Cuba, they just came out with a Vernonia report. It's really extensive. They have an Amsonia one as well, and I encourage you to look at that because it's a really great resource for both gardeners and garden designers. But when you look at trail programs across our Midwest, Iowa is left out of that. So, like I mentioned, there are some trail programs in Wisconsin, in Minnesota, and in Illinois at Chicago. But we do not have a trail program within about 300 miles of central Iowa. And so when I started at the Iowa Arboretum, that is what I sought to do. So we had a gap in local data on perennial and shrub trial performance. Iowa in particular has a unique climate, I've found, especially when it comes to high and low temperatures, our humidity, and our hot and humid nights, which does a lot of really interesting things to plant growth. We also have a really high incidence of extreme weather events, and so we frequently get tornadoes. This last year was a good example of us going from a flood season into severe drought. And at the Arboretum in particular, on a given day, our maximum wind speed is 35 miles an hour. And so our wind is unrelenting. And so perennials and shrubs need to be able to survive that. And then our soil type is oftentimes very dependent on where glaciers were 10,000 to 30,000 years ago. So our unique soils happen to be different than a lot of the country and a lot of other trial sites. And then we also take into account irrigation water qualities. Iowa, being an agricultural state, has a lot of differences when it comes to irrigation water. So if you're using well water versus municipal, that can have a very different effect on plant growth in your garden. And another thing that I like to talk about in the Midwest in particular, coming from Colorado where humidity is not a problem, we here in Iowa in August are drowning in our air because of summer corn sweat. And so that's one thing that I wanted to specifically look at is how do our plants perform in August when our temperatures are really high and the humidity is at 100% saturation. Like if we're having fog in the afternoons, what is that doing to plants and what plants can survive that? As I mentioned, this year has been kind of a topsy-turvy when it comes to drought. And so here in Iowa, we started the year in severe or extreme drought. We had 9 inches of rain in May, and it continued to rain into June. And so by midsummer, we didn't have drought anywhere in the state. And then by the end of the year, we were back into drought conditions. And so these plants that we're trialing need to be really tough to survive all of this going on at once. And this is a picture from the Arboretum taken in 2020. We sustained mid-continent derecho, which is basically an inland straight line hurricane. And we were experiencing winds of up to 165 miles an hour, which took out a lot of trees across the Midwest. Our area in particular was hit really hard. And so as these extreme weather events continue to happen, these plants need to be able to survive or look good after something like that happens. And so if you ever visit the Iowa Arboretum, the trial program is located in the southern portion of our cultivated acres. You can see a khaki colored little pin drop there. Google Maps has not updated since the trial program had been started, but that's the general area that it's located. And we have installed a weather station at the Arboretum just to keep track of our climatic data. And so on average, our part of Iowa has about 36 inches of precipitation. We're at about 1,000 feet in elevation, and we are solidly zone 5, where we're at. And in those circles, you can see a comparison between our historical average precipitation for those months and then the Arboretum's observed precipitation for 2024. And in May, we had twice the amount of annual precipitation that you'd expect in that month alone. And then by August, we were experiencing drought conditions. And so our rain accumulation was about on average for the entire year, but it was very heavy in the spring and then gone by the time summer hit. And then when you look at our maximum and minimum average temperatures, the historical average maximum is that lighter red, and then the Arboretum's observed maximum temperature is the darker red. And you can see here that we were hotter than average this year. And then if you look at the minimum temperature, the darker blue is the arboretums observed, and we were colder. And so we have basically gone into a situation where the daytime temps are hotter than average, and the nighttime lows, or just the general climatic lows, are lower than average. So these plants are going through a lot. And then our humidity was rather average. When it comes to humidity, Iowa is just known for generally having above 50% humidity during the growing season. It was only August that we saw higher than average humidity. And so when it comes to the numbers for what we're trialing, we have about 15 industry partners that we work with. That number grows kind of constantly as new people discover that we're here and doing perennial and shrub trials. And our trial program is overseen by 13 committee members. That number is also growing over time. And in 2024, it was the first year that we opened up the trial program for public evaluation. And in 2024 alone, we had over 100 public evaluators. We had 111 new varieties of plant material. And by planting in 2025 this season, we will anticipate having nearly 300 individual plant varieties in this garden being trialed. And so to give you an idea of who we're working with, it's a lot of the national brands that you will see at garden centers and wholesalers across the country. And so if you're familiar with the Proven Winners brand, we work with both their perennial partner, which is Walter's Gardens, as well as their shrub and tree trial program through Spring Meadow. We work with Bailey Nurseries, which owns the First Editions, Easy Elegance, and Endless Summer brand, as well as a lot of different perennial producers. And so we're trying to get as much of that new plant material that is landing on shelves at garden centers as possible. So all of these new varieties are what we're trialing at the Arboretum. And I wanted to throw this out there that we're not only limited by companies that expressly introduce new varieties, anyone can submit an accession to the Arboretum's trial program. And so if your county master gardeners are interested in trying a new plant, but want to make sure that it's done scientifically, you can submit an accession. If you have a native species that you don't know how well it does in a garden situation, you can submit that for us to take care of and to collect data on. If you are a person that dabbles in breeding, whether that's daylilies or hostas or something other than that, we will take your hobby breeding work as well, or just any kind of demonstration that you'd like to do or marketing. And so it's not just closed off to only national companies. We do local breeding projects as well. So what does evaluation look like? I have a full-time staff member, my curatorial assistant, who is in charge of coordinating the trial. And so she takes data and pictures bi-weekly on all of the plants. And then the 13 committee members are responsible for also evaluating once a month. And that committee is made up of a diverse group of folks, anywhere from academics to county master gardeners to garden designers and also nursery staff and other public garden staff. And so when we're doing these evaluations, I want to make sure we get as many perspectives across the production chain as possible so that we're listening to both the end consumer as well as people further up into the industry to give an unbiased report on these plants. And the evaluation we use is a rating scale. And so we start at 1. If something is dead or not flowering, it technically is a 0. But plants that perform poorly are assigned a 1, and things that are beyond our expectations receive a 5. And so every month, every plant variety will receive something between 1 to 5 for the plant. And then flowers, the rating scale is used as a percentage of flower coverage on the plant. So if something is only covered about 20% with flowers, it receives a 1 rating for its flowers. And then if it's 100% covered in flowers, it receives a 5. So that's kind of what this is describing here. And then we do a lot of other additional considerations. So things like uniformity or pest and disease resistance. We want to make sure that all of the plants planted in the same way, grown the same way, all look the same at the end of the season, as well as don't have any severe pest issues. We do a little bit of evaluation for whether or not it has a potential to become invasive. And so, especially our non-native plants, we are actively looking to see what the seedling load looks like at the end of the season. And then if it has any seasonal interest, so if you think of something like a hellebore that is outside of our usual evaluation time, we do go out there to make sure that in the winter and the spring, anything from twig color to winter flowering is accounted for, so that it's not just based off of a single season's worth of growth. And then, of course, survival. It has to survive summers and winters. And so at the end of the trial period, how many are left over is a very big consideration as well, because if only half of them have survived, it's not a very viable plant. And then just some additional data we collect is the specific pest problems, any plant management decisions. So with shrubs, if we decided to prune something, we take that into account and put it in the report. It's easy to propagate. We've got a lot of perennials that are grown from seed. And so if it's not very successfully grown from seed in a greenhouse situation, we don't want to promote that plant because it's hard for the industry to get it into retail locations or to the consumer. Similar situation with the availability to market. If it's not available from wholesalers, we don't want to necessarily promote that plant either because we'll say this is a great plant, but then you won't be able to get it. And so we do take that into account. And then we also measure the end of season plant size. So every year we're measuring how big these plants got in a single season. And this year was our first public evaluation day. And so we invited a select group of folks to come try out what a day celebrating these plants looked like. And so people came out and filled out a small questionnaire telling us about their favorite plants and why it was their favorite plant. And we were able to then create a press release out to the industry to tell them what the consumer trends are going to look like for the next season or what more of our local people wanted to have available in the local industry. It was very successful. This year, we're going to be opening it up to everybody. And so the general public in across the state is going to be invited. If you're out of state, you're more than welcome to come out to Iowa to participate. But it should be a really great time with a bunch of plant nerds looking at really beautiful plants. And so I've mentioned the report. So what this is it's a single document where all of the data that had been collected from the previous year is compiled and analyzed. And so for instance, this particular plant that I'm showing is Hibiscus summerific edge of night. We'll learn more about this plant later. And in this report, we detail how tall and how wide that plant had gotten in a single season, as well as its flower color. And then there on the right, you can see the number that we planted and the number that have survived a single winter. Below that is our committee's plant ratings and comments. And so you can see in those plant ratings, especially mid-season, it was doing really great. It had a stream of fives. And so it exceeded expectations for most of the summer. And it had really great comments as well. This trial report's very similar to others throughout the country. I know that Penn State University does a very similar report to this, as well as other university reports. But this is probably my favorite part here is the coordinator ratings. Because she's out there every 2 weeks, you get a snapshot of what it does throughout a season. And so, for instance, here you can see the F stands for flowering. You can see that by the end of July, it had already started flowering. It peaked in August, but continued to flower until the end of September. And so this hibiscus is extremely long flowering. That gives you as a gardener an idea of how long you can expect for this plant to flower. Or if you happen to be a garden designer as well, it gives you a good idea of its season of interest. And so all of these resources are available at the URL at the bottom. And if you just go to the Arboretum's website, all of this information is publicly available. And let's see if I can get my face out of the way of this. Um, so if you see a QR code here, this QR code is a link to sign up for the Iowa Arboretum Trial Program's newsletter. And so, if you are interested in learning more or hearing more about the trial program and receiving that report, that information is shared regularly through our newsletter. It's about 3 times a year, and it has some really great information and notes about some really, really cool plants. And if you're interested in the public evaluation, we'll also release that RSVP through the newsletter as well. Here's what our website looks like. And down there on the bottom right-hand corner, you can see subscribe to the newsletter, our resources page, and our photographs. And so that resources page will have any of the articles, newsletters, or reports that we have drafted so far. And then the photographs will have actual pictures of these plants in the garden so you can see what it looks like if you're not able to actually visit. And we are still too young of a trial program to actually announce our top performers, but after 3 years, we will start announcing our perennial top performers. Our first perennials were planted in 2023, and so this coming winter is when we will be able to announce our top performers. They've had 3 growing seasons and at least 2 winters to receive that award. And then for shrubs, we give them 5 years, and so our first round will be available as top performers in 2027. And again, when we're making these judgment calls about these top performers, they have to be readily available from wholesalers so that they can make their way down to home gardeners if they are released as a top performer. And so now we're going to talk about the plants that did well. This is not an all-inclusive or exhaustive list. These just happen to be some that the public were really pleased with, as well as all of our evaluators. However, there are a lot more plants that did really well this year in the trial program. And so I'll start with 2023 perennials. So these perennials have survived at least 1 winter and 2 growing seasons. And the first here is this Dark Side of the Moon Astilbe. This is from Walter's Gardens and Proven Winners. I know for a fact that it is available from retail now. And one of the things that's so striking about this plant is that astilbes are generally considered a shade perennial. They're not often planted in sun and can do well unless it's a really wet climate. And this plant was planted in the sun and didn't even miss a beat. And that foliage emerges purple and stays a dark, beautiful purple throughout the season. Its mature size is 32 inches tall at the top of those flowers and about 2 feet wide. And it can basically do full sun to shade without any problems. It has average water needs and blooms generally midsummer and has experienced very few pest issues. And we've had 100% survival after 1 winter. I believe that this would be great for containers, your shade garden, or your perennial border. And it has really great potential for cut flowers because it has almost leafless flower stems way above the foliage. And some additional comments were made that it has season-long dark foliage and stunning rosy purple blooms. I've talked about Edge of Night hibiscus a little bit already, but this plant has been a rock star across the country. Ours is exceptionally good. And this hibiscus is a smaller form. It comes from the Proven Winners brand as well. And garden hibiscus can sometimes become monsters. They grow 6 to 8 feet tall and then flop over or something like that. And this is a dwarf form. So we're expecting it to top out at about 4 feet high and 4 feet wide. And one of the most stunning things about this plant is that when it emerges in the spring, it's almost black. And then as the season progresses, it fades into a lovely dark purple color. And then those dinner plate size hibiscus flowers come out, and it's just stunning. This one had a really long bloom time also for hibiscus, so we saw flowers from late July all the way until early September, and that foliage looked great until frost. It does get a little bit of Japanese beetles, but not anything too crazy. We didn't even have to do Japanese beetle management on these plants because they didn't really do all that much damage. 100% survival. It can take wet feet. We've also seen that it's pretty drought resistant and drought tolerant. We didn't even have wilting, and we hadn't received rain in over 5 weeks. I might have forgotten to mention for irrigation for this garden, we only water to establish. And so these perennials I'm presenting right now received no form of irrigation for the 2023 season and still looked good. Or 2024 season and still looked good. Next is this Niagara Falls switchgrass, another proven winners variety. They've been rocking it lately. And one of the things that was so striking to our committee about this plant is that in the spring it emerges a beautiful blue-green color with some purple accents to it. And so it's just a really nice, cool colored panicum. Another nice feature about it is this one is also not a monster. It's kind of a dwarf panicum, and so you can expect it to be 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide. And when it blooms, it's like a stunning white cloud of those seed heads. And so I anticipate this being really great for mixed containers if you use perennials in containers. Could also make a great cut flower. It's also salt tolerant, and so if it's placed next to a pathway that gets snow removal, it should be able to survive that road salt. And overall, it was just upright, handsome, and it had very attractive seed heads. This one is less readily available. However, I have started to see retailers carry this plant, and this is Little Red Fox, Little Blue Stem. It's from Intrinsic Perennial Gardens. If you're not familiar, they're based out of just outside of Chicago in Hebron, Illinois. Brett Horvath is the owner of that. And this little blue stem was striking mostly because it also emerged a nice blue-green color with red accents. And by the time that this plant went to seed, its fall color was a rainbow, anywhere from blues to greens to reds to purples, and overall was a lovely effect. As little blue stems go, it's also very upright, and we did not see any flopping. Even with the amount of spring rain that we got and the wind that we received this year, I did not see any flopping from this plant. And the survival percentage is at 77%, which I think was an establishment issue. It wasn't a winter hardiness issue. And so take that into consideration with this one. But if you can find this plant, either mail order or from retail, I would jump at the chance to get it because it's a really good one. And then I think this is the last of the 2023 perennials, Thunderdome Aster. This is my all-time favorite perennial so far. I call this the Meryl Streep of plants because it can basically do anything. And so when it emerges in the spring, it's a lovely, lush, dense green ball. It looks great in the garden. It looks great in borders or mass plantings. And as it grows, it gets pretty tall. I mean, it was probably 3 to 4 feet tall by the end there. And I think it will surpass Purple Dome as a really, just really overall great aster. It is a hybrid between the New England aster and the aromatic aster, so it gets that lovely dome shape, but it's also a little bit elevated. And where New England aster will sometimes lose its lower leaves and start to look a little ugly, they call it losing its skirt. This plant stayed green the entire season without any dieback from lower leaves. And with it being a hybrid, it is believed to be sterile. And so, with those flowers not getting fertilized, it bloomed all season long. So, we had flowers from early August all the way until frost, which wasn't until the end of October this year. So, if you're looking for a giant purple mass in your garden, this is the perfect plant for that. Very vigorous. And it was also, when it was flowering, it also shook because of how many pollinators were on it. Almost everyone who evaluated this plant in flower couldn't even believe how many pollinators were on this plant. So next I'll move on to 2023 shrubs. So again, these plants have only survived one winter in the ground, but 2 summer seasons. And the first is Cobalt and Gold Hypericum. I believe this is a first editions brand plant from Bailey's, so it should be pretty readily available. But this thing is just cute. It's a beautiful evergreen plant that then gets covered in beautiful little white flowers that bumblebees adore. It has pretty low water needs once it's established. It's very drought tolerant, and it's a selection from a native species to North America. And with its small, compact size, I imagine it would be a great low hedge or something to go along pathways or sidewalks. Um, we did notice that in summer heat, it can defoliate a little bit, but the plant is still alive. It's just stressed out from dry heat. But overall, it was a favorite across a lot of our evaluators. Next is Spicy Devil Nine Bark, another Bailey Nurseries introduction. Bailey's is coming out with a brand new line of dwarf nine barks, and this just happens to be one of them. And one of the things that kind of caught all of us off guard was that it had that beautiful dark foliage, and we didn't see any fungal issues, no mildews or anything like that, no splotching on the leaves. It stayed that beautiful dark burgundy color the whole season. When it flowers, it gets covered in these dainty little pink flowers, and pollinators love those flowers as well. It is native to North America, and this plant has just overall been really great for us. Some of these were planted bare root, and they established successfully very well. And they should be available for most retailers pretty soon if they're not out already. And the mature size on this is 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Next, we have Jade Parade Sand Cherry. This plant is exceptional. It creeps across the ground, becomes a lovely ground cover, and then in the spring, it flowers really brilliantly and has really good fall color. And so, if you're looking for that like parking lot plant, this is perfect. And if you're looking for a ground cover or something to drape over a wall, I'd also encourage you getting this. It's very hardy. We've seen it even get 8 feet wide, but it responds to pruning really nicely. Next up is Little Mischief Rose. This is an Easy Elegance brand plant from Bailey's. And despite it having some Japanese beetles, it very rarely had enough for it to take away from the display. And so this plant has had zero irrigation, zero babying, and it emerged this spring with glossy green leaves, no tip dieback, and it bloomed from mid-June till frost. And so if you're looking for a pink explosion in your garden and a pretty easy rose, this is a great selection. 100% survival in a single winter. We're expecting this to be pretty hardy overall. And it was just an abundant bloomer for a rose. And then the last 2023 shrub here is Galactic Pink Chast Tree. I will say a word of warning on these chast trees. They've been reclassified as Zone 5, but they're treated more like a perennial. So these trees or these chast trees will die all the way back down to the ground and then reshoot from the base rather than having any developed woody tissue. And we're kind of expecting that a 1 in 10 year low in a freeze could also kill some of these individuals. But we're crossing our fingers that that's not true and that these plants pull through every winter. And so this plant has really, really great, dense, dark green foliage. And then it blooms with these beautiful pink flowers. There's a whole line of these coming out. Some of them were submitted in 2024. And it's just overall a really great plant. I think it would look great in a container or even just planted as an annual because it's just so striking. And we're recommending it as a replacement for butterfly bush. So next we'll do 2024 perennials. Keep in mind that these have not survived a winter yet. And so my recommendations here are that they just look great from a first year plant and they might look great in a container or used as a bedding plant or an annual with the hope that they do end up later on becoming really hardy and surviving the winter. We just don't have that data yet. And so this is Firefly Red Pop Yarrow. It's a beautiful red selection of the fern leaf yarrow. And we grew these from plugs into quartz and then planted them out, and they filled their space in a single season. And they bloomed prolifically that whole time. They flower a beautiful paprika red and then fade slowly into more of a peach color, which is very complementary with the rest of the blooms. And so overall, this would just be a really great plant. It bloomed from late August until frost for us. Next is Pixie Meadow Bright Coneflower. This has been out in the industry, I think, for a little while, but it is reportedly the first dwarf coneflower in the market. And what do I mean by dwarf? It does not reach taller than 18 inches tall, but does get 24 inches wide. And when it blooms, the foliage is a beautiful tight pincushion, and it blooms on the top of leafless stems. And so it's a really great effect. You get really dense, tight foliage with light and airy blooms above. And as that cone fades, it's actually rather handsome. Some echinaceas can look like dogs after they've flowered, but these remained pretty handsome after they flowered. We saw very few pest issues, and we expect this to be really great in mixed containers or as a mass planting, even just as a ground cover between larger perennials. This one was kind of a wild card, especially for our public evaluation day. And so this is Tempo Coral Avens from Terra Nova Nurseries. We have not even seen this flower yet, and it was a public favorite. And the reason why is because of that dense, uniform foliage that's basically a green bowling ball in the landscape. It's even hard to tell apart individual plants from photographs because they're just so uniform and so beautifully dark green. And so if you're looking for like a hedging effect with short perennials, this is perfect for that. When it does eventually bloom, it'll have a beautiful peachy coral flower in early May for us Midwesterners, maybe earlier in lower zones. Um, but this would be great in containers. I think it would be great along pathways or even as a specimen plant with just that beautiful, dark, dense green foliage. And then we've got Dust in the Wind switchgrass. This was another unexpected one. The reason why it is so striking is because it is a purple leaf form of our native switchgrass. And so even in the spring, it emerges a very dark green with purple leaf tips, and it stays that way throughout the season. And eventually, when it flowers, it's like this dark cloud of seed heads over the plant. It should eventually become a full-sized switchgrass, so we're expecting to be about 5 feet high, but we have not seen any flopping or lodging so far, which is really good for switchgrasses. And this again would make a really good cut flower, really good container plant if you would rather plant it in a container or just in mass plantings or borders, a good parking lot plant there too. For 2024 shrubs, again, please be careful with these because we haven't seen them overwinter yet. But this button bush has been in the industry for a couple of years now called Fiber Optics, another Bailey Nurseries one. And if you've ever seen a button bush in the wild, they can be really squirrely. We've seen them where they're 12 feet tall and 12 feet wide, but only have like three main branches. And this has just been a dense, compact, and beautifully green little shrub for us. It is a dwarf form of button bush, so it should only get about 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide. When it flowers, they are little white ping pong balls that bees love. It's literally a circle of flowers. And this would be just a really great plant for both drought conditions and for wet conditions. It's very resilient to both. It's a floodplain species, so it can handle both wet feet and prolonged periods of drought. And that glossy green foliage just really got all of us with like a dark red stem. This one we're really optimistic about. All of us are crossing our fingers and saying a little prayer about these, but we are trying to trial some hardy crepe myrtles from Bailey's. And the pictures that you're seeing here is from the first year planted in the ground. And so even being used as maybe a tropical container plant as an annual or something that you haul into your unheated garage just to protect it from winter, it is going to be a really, really fabulous plant. We're expecting it to be treated more like a perennial, so it'll die all the way back down to the ground and then reflush the year after that. We'll see about its hardiness, but even just a 1 year plant, it's stunning. So both of these varieties have dark purple foliage and then just really striking, brilliant flower colors there. And I expect this to be a really great plant for the Midwest, even if it's not hardy here, but a great tropical looking plant for us. And then My Girl Rose was this year's favorite. Japanese beetles were not a problem on this plant. I've been told it did have a little bit of a smell. I never actually smelled the roses, believe it or not, when I was out there. But the bloom time was from early May all the way until frost, so it just never stopped blooming. And at one point, we got asked if they were peonies because the flowers were just so big and aged so gracefully on that dark green glossy foliage. It didn't present any type of fungal issues, and it had actually a really nice purplish fall color. And so we're very excited to see how this performs over the next couple of years. So with that, I want to formally invite everybody to our public evaluation day in 2025. That date is set for August 9th. And it's just going to be a really great time talking about good plants. We've invited many of our industry coordinators and cooperators to come participate and interact with the public so that you can uh, have your desires heard and maybe met. And they want to know what your preferences are. They want to know what plants make you excited. And we overall just want to collect as much information as we can from the public to keep a more well-rounded performance evaluation together. So scan this QR code. It'll take you to our newsletter. That's the best way to keep up to date with our RSVP process. But otherwise, I want to thank everyone for having me on tonight. And Alicia, I think I'm ready for some questions.
Great. Thank you, David. Someone did just mention that that date is during the Iowa State Fair, and they're a little bit upset about that. But
I know we did that intentionally because we thought it would attract people to Central Iowa too.
I think that's actually a great plan because there will be more people in central Iowa for that. So yes, thank you for sharing that great information with us. One thing that someone also asked is, can you put that information back up about how they can get the reports of what's going on with the trial garden?
Yes, I can pull up that slide again.
Okay, great. And then I'll start asking you some questions. So one of the first questions is the arboretum plots that you're putting these plants into, do they include a different variety of soil composition types, or what's the soil like in these trial areas?
Yes, so our soil type, the arboretum was originally a woodland and then it was tilled to become farmland. And basically, we're dealing with a clay parent topsoil that has a lot of loam in it. But one thing to keep in mind with the arboretum site is that we're very flat. And so we're basically dealing with a really light loamy soil that tends to be really wet. So this last spring, when we had all of that rain, what normally would have maybe drained away, it perched on the top of the soil. Our water table is in some places less than 8 inches down. And so it's not an easy soil. It is a very challenging soil. I do like to be upfront with that because the average gardener's soil, all of our soils have challenges. This one just happens to be that it's wet, it's very organically rich, but we deal with a lot of root rot issues versus maybe dry issues and compaction, things like that. So
And I may have missed this. I know someone else missed it because they asked about it. How many of each variety do you start with?
that's a great question. So for shrubs, we do 5 individual plants. We found that 5 gives us a good number that if they start to die off at some point, we still have individuals left. And then for perennials, we do about 20 per variety. If you could tell in some of those photos, they were in blocks of 9, and so we do 2 sets of 9 or 10 in the garden. So the plots are different. There are some differences in our soil texture as you go a couple hundred feet away, but 20 perennials and 5 shrubs.
And a few times you mentioned the pollinators, how many pollinators were attracted to some of these plants. Is pollinator support one of the characteristics that's assessed, or that is that just another thing that you are noticing as you're going through the trials?
Yeah, so when we initially started this program, we weren't expecting to be surveying pollinators by any means. Like we knew that many of these native plants, we do have like wild ecotype species type plants planted in this. We knew that pollinators were going to be attracted, but it hadn't really occurred to us to do a pollinator survey. And so now in future years, we'll be collecting that data separately We don't have the technology or the staff at the moment to do like a pollinator specific count, but we are looking to evaluate the attractiveness of plants to pollinators. So that data will be starting to get collected. Luckily, Fatima, our trial coordinator, does have an entomology background, and we'll be looking at pollinator counts on these perennials and shrubs eventually.
And once these plants are introduced to the public, let's say they go onto the market and they've been trialed and things like that, is there a good place for consumers to find information about what has changed as these new varieties have been developed, some of the characteristics that have changed, so that if they're looking for something, a specific aspect, where would they go to find that information?
Yeah, I mean, these trial programs really are like a good base for that information. And so as these reports come out every year, you'll get a better idea of the things coming down the pipeline and the things that have happened in recent history. So for instance, when I was at Colorado State University, that program was almost 20 years old, and all of the reports were still publicly available. And so if you were curious about maybe an echinacea variety that had had some genetic improvement or something like that. You could go back to old reports and see how the original plant had done versus how this improved variety was doing now. I would say a lot of times these plant breeders on their website keep a lot of that information as well. So if you go to Walter's Gardens website, they oftentimes have some of these trial report comments on their website with that information. And older varieties, they sometimes have historical pages on. So you can kind of see what past introductions have been if they're not available anymore, things like that. So I hope that
And you
answers the question.
mentioned You mentioned that you would start sharing like the winners, the ones that are recommended after the 3-year trial period, and you've seen how they've done with some winters. How long do you expect this trial program to be in existence? It's, I assume, going to go past 3 years.
Yeah, in perpetuity. So we accept new varieties every year. So this trial program isn't ever going away. As new varieties are developed every year, we'll be accepting those new varieties. And we're still kind of deciding what to do after a trial program has run its course. So for instance, the 2023 plants that are perennials are going to be done this winter. And a lot of us have the feeling that we'd like to take longer term data on those plants. And so maybe they won't get evaluated every year, but maybe every 3 years after that to get that long term data on some of these longer lived perennials. But the trial program hopefully will always be in existence. And as new varieties come out onto the market, we will be trialing them for forever.
Yeah, and the garden is working with a lot of partners. You've talked about some of the nurseries that are distributing these plant materials. Does the garden do any sort of advocacy with partners to discourage selling or growing of plants that are invasive to our area?
Yes and no. So we haven't been around long enough to really get into the invasive potential for some of these plants. However, we are seeing some varieties that we're like, whoa, we're starting to find seedlings of this plant 5, 10 feet away. And so that's an indicator to us as the evaluators to give that feedback directly back and say, hey, this plant has escaped from the trial program into the lawn or something like that, and give that necessary feedback back. And it's on us at that point that when we go to select those top performers, not to promote that plant. We don't really have the relationship where we can give like that direct, like, you should not be promoting this plant back to the industry because ultimately they're selling what consumers are purchasing. And so it's a consumer education thing. We need to be telling our neighbors not to plant those plants versus trying to get them to stop selling it. Because if at the end of the day they need to make money, if that's what people are buying, they'll continue to produce it.
That's a great point, and you got to keep an eye out for those rogue plants. No one likes a rogue plant.
No, no.
So we also have some people who are interested in coming to visit the gardens, which why would you not? The gardens are a beautiful, wonderful place. So where can guests go to find a guide for visiting the garden and when things might be in bloom so they can plan their visits to come see you?
Yeah, so we've just recently started redoing all of our garden pages on our website. So if you go to iowaarboretum.org, at the top there is a an icon for our plants. And if you click on that, each individual garden has its own web page, and oftentimes it has the best times of year to see those gardens. So for instance, we have an extensive iris and daylily collection, and so it details in there that you want to be here the first 2 weeks in June to capture 600 different iris varieties, and then revisit in July to see all the daylilies. And so our website really is that rich resources of information to give you a good idea of when to bloom or when to come see things bloom. And if you want to see things in the trial specifically blooming, I encourage you to look at past reports because that flowering information that I shared with you from coordinator ratings is a pretty good indicator of when it should flower every year.